All right. So hopefully everybody had a good break. Not the ideal time for it to fall, but we've got a class period here. We can kind of do some review, catch up on those modules that we covered before break, which will be on the exam, which is Thursday. Hopefully we all know this, right? So second midterm in class, just like the first one. Make sure you're here a little bit early so we can get going right at 8 o'clock. Awesome proctors helping me pass out the exams. Same kind of thing, 2 forms. We'll pass them kind of alternating. The only thing you should need is something to write with, a calculator, right? It's not on your phone. And I will have blank paper. If you want some extra paper, you can write on the exam. It'll look very similar to the first one in terms of the format, 25 multiple choice questions. May or may not be a bonus question. Might be feeling nice. But it'll look very similar. Those, I've kind of got some questions, people stopping by just before I kind of get too far into things. I put an announcement up. I'm not going to be available for office hours on Wednesday. So I had extended office hours yesterday, which the announcement kind of gave you to them. I had quite a few people show up. I'll also be available today. I have a class that gets over at 2. I'll head right back to my office. I'll be there from about 2 to 3:30 if you have any questions there, okay? If you do have questions, you want to send me them via email, I'll still kind of be able to check my emails, kind of get some responses out on Wednesday, also throughout today as well. So as you're kind of, wrapping up your studying, I'll still be able to kind of respond to emails. I just won't be available for office hours on Wednesday, okay? Other than that, I would, just before we kind of dive into material or ask you guys for specific questions, I've gotten some questions and some things, maybe concerns I have, but this is B251. There are other B251 sections. Do you think studying the 251 materials from the other sections will be more or less beneficial than studying the ones that I've given you? Less, right? I'm giving you the questions I give you for a reason. I'm giving you that practice exam because I think it looks similar to. It's got more questions, so it's making you over-prepared, but it's giving you anything that type of question you could see on the exam. So if I was studying, this would be the rank order in which I would study things. It is great to go back through the book. I don't think it's the most efficient use of your time. The most efficient and effective use of your time in studying for this exam is probably working through as many problems as possible. So I would start with the midterm practice problems, that second midterm practice, right? So I said this isn't a cumulative class in the sense that I'm not going to go back and ask you module 2 type questions, but we do build on it. Everything builds on itself, right? So the only material that'll be covered on this exam, you can kind of see that on the practice exam, will be everything we've covered since the last exam. So modules 5 and 6, I kind of combined together. So that all the way through module 9, okay? So studying those practice problems, making sure, that you have a pretty good understanding of why the correct answer is what it is. So even if you sit down, take it, you see you got some wrong, you can look at the answer key, try to figure out and try to understand why the correct answer is what it is. All right? If you're feeling pretty comfortable with those practice problems, you spent some time on that, I would then progress towards reviewing and going back through and doing the old quiz questions. You had materials available to you then, you had your notes, you had other people. I can't constrict that. And so going back through those quiz questions without notes, without things, right? Trying to see, could I solve these questions on an exam is also a good set of questions to start to work on. After I do that, if I'm feeling comfortable with those, next thing I would progress to is the practice problems for those quizzes, right? Between all of those, that is a lot of questions, right? I don't know, there's what, 12 quiz questions, so 48 questions, plus the 30-ish questions, plus the practice problems are about another 40. You're talking well over, somewhere between 100 and 150 questions there that you can kind of review. Now, if you want more material, right, those in-class questions we've used, I go through those with you. So those would be good ones to make sure you could go through and review them and answer them on your own. Got all those in-class questions, quizzes sitting up there on Canvas, you can go back and review. Those would just be more questions that would be good to work through. But that's kind of the order in which I would kind of go through things, right? Practice exam, quiz questions, practice problems for those quizzes, in-class quiz questions. If you want to kind of review your notes, that's fine, right? If you take really detailed, really good notes, maybe that's going to be a effective use of your time. Everyone's a little bit different, but I think on average, and I kind of have to speak to averages, I think the most effective use of your time is reviewing those problems in the order in which I just laid out. Okay. Any questions for me logistically about the exam before we kind of get to content stuff? No? Any questions not related to content? We're good? Okay. So I think you showed up here. I think I know, most of these questions I think are valuable to work through. Some of them are easier than others. So I'll kind of field questions first. I want to make sure I'm going through questions that people have the most problems with. So anyone have any questions they want to see worked through to start out here? It can be from the practice exam. I would probably start there if you have questions there. If you have questions on some of the old practice problems or quizzes, we can look at those. But I would, probably start out here with this practice exam would be the most useful questions to ask first. So I'll go here and then over there. All right. So suppose we've got elasticity, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So this concept, right, when we have a tax, right, I'll just kind of review more in general. I'll eventually get to the question. Don't worry. So we've got a market. Hopefully on the exam, you can draw out a market. What does this curve represent? It's upward sloping, so it is, which represents producers' marginal costs. Downward sloping curve, this is demand. This should represent consumers' marginal benefits. Okay. We said when there's without a tax, the market equilibrium is going to be right here. Okay. If we have a tax, for the sake of what we're doing in this exam, the way you can model and draw taxes are always taxes on producers. You can get similar implications if you do it on consumers. Everything I'm going to do, just to kind of make it simple, anything that I would show you on the exam would be a tax on producers. Okay. So if I tax producers, what's that going to do? Which of these curves is going to shift? Supply, right? I have added an additional cost such that at every quantity, the supply curve is now the supply curve plus the tax. So if I were to have values here, what's the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax? The value of the tax. So if I want to know the value of the tax, I just look at any quantity and I look at the vertical distance between that supply curve and the supply curve with the tax. Okay. Now, with the tax, what do producers now do? Well, we have a different decision made in the market, right? The new supply curve hits demand over here. So what did this tax do? It reduced quantity. Okay. In reducing quantity, what's going to happen? Well, all of these units that were being produced and sold on the market, no longer, right? We're stopping at this quantity. So what is any type of surplus? So whether or not we talk about consumer, producer, or just total surplus, when we talk about surplus, the general form is the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. If we're talking about total surplus, it's the marginal benefits and marginal costs of the entire market. So we've got marginal benefits and marginal costs. So for every unit here that we're no longer see being sold, what was true about the surplus? The marginal benefit was greater than the marginal cost. So this is all surplus that we are now missing out on. So what would that represent? Deadweight loss, right? Or a loss of total surplus. Now, part of this loss of surplus, if we go back to thinking about if I didn't have this tax, we would have had producer and consumer surplus. So some of this deadweight loss is going to come from consumers, some is going to come from producers. But some of it might, more of it might come from consumer surplus than producer. But how do we know that? Right? Well, we said, and this might be not necessarily saying you should draw this out on the exam, but just to kind of reiterate this point, let's say I had a demand curve. Let's say that suppliers were perfectly what? So if the quantity that they supplied doesn't depend on the price, we would say they are perfectly, they're not changing, so they would be perfectly inelastic. So think about a scenario where we had perfectly inelastic supply, right? Kind of think about that would push the quantity down here. So all of this surplus that we're kind of losing or missing out on, right, is going to represent a loss of producer surplus, right? They're not responding at all. All of deadweight loss is going to come from producers. An easier way of doing that, you don't have to draw out like perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic demand. We said as long as the elasticity of supply is less than the elasticity of demand, right? Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. Those values that were given you in the problem, the elasticity of demand is always going to be what? As prices go up, people buy less, so it's always going to be negative. So when we're comparing these, we're really comparing the absolute values, okay? So you're looking for whichever value is lower in absolute terms, that would represent it's closer to zero. They are more inelastic. Whoever is more inelastic is going to bear more of the burden of that tax. Or the loss of producer surplus in this example would be greater than the loss in consumer surplus. Now, let's see. Hopefully that lines up with the problem. I should have probably looked at the numbers a little bit closer. So we have the elasticity of demand was negative 0.9. The elasticity of supply was 0.5. Sure enough, we had producers being a little bit more inelastic, which means they're going to bear more of the burden. Okay? Now, both people were inelastic here. So it doesn't matter if it's, both of them can be. It's who's more inelastic. You could also have a scenario, if I can get this paper to come on, where let's say I had the elasticity of demand was negative 2.5, and the elasticity of supply is 3.2. Okay. Well, once again, who's going to bear more of the burden of this tax? Yeah, we look at the absolute value. So here I've got what? 2.5, 3.2. Well, now who's more inelastic? They're both elastic. This is an elasticity greater than 1, but consumers are more inelastic, which means who's going to bear more of the burden? Once again, I think the example I use is like if a truck's coming at me, there are two people are standing there. Whoever responds less, the other person can push them out of the way, right? And they're going to hit by the truck. Whoever's not responding to that truck coming at them is going to bear the burden of that, right? So whoever is more inelastic, we're going to say is going to bear more of the burden of that tax. Okay? So don't let that negative sign kind of trip you up. We're just comparing the absolute values there. Does that answer your question? Okay. And I saw a question up here too, so I'll go there next. Maybe the person's looking at me. No? Okay. So I guess we'll go on to the next person. 25. And then person on the left side, if you have, we'll get to your question next. All right. So 25. Yeah, this is a good one to ask. This is maybe a little bit tougher than I would ask you, although the concepts, there's different questions I could ask. This is a really good one to understand. So in this problem, we were told we have two goods, ramen noodles and steak, I think. No caviar, right? So ramen noodles and caviar. We're told what the quantities start out at, and we were told after a price change, which I believe is that the price of ramen goes down. After that price change, what is the new quantity purchased of both of these goods? And then we're asked about which of these are correct. So I'll work through how I could ask you any type of question about this that you could work through, not just this one, right? So we're starting out in these types of problems. The first thing that you want to identify is what price is changing. So it has different discussions about the income, the substitution, the total effect. Well, those effects are going to come from a price change. So here we had the price of ramen was going down. We said that ramen was an inferior good, and we had caviar was the normal good. Okay. So we can break this down into three types of effects: the substitution effect, the income effect, and then the total effect. So in this problem, it's a little bit different than some of the other problems we had. I really gave you the total effect because I told you starting out, they were consuming how much? 10 packets of ramen and 5 ounces of caviar. After the price change, they went to 12 packets of ramen. So what happened to the quantity of ramen? What was the total effect? It went from 10 to 12, so it went up. What was the total effect on caviar? We went from 5 to 4. So the total effect of this price change was that we bought less. So this is a problem where I gave you the total effect. I'll talk afterwards about what would it look like if I didn't, but in this one, you know kind of where you started, where you stopped. Now, to get between those 2 points, there's going to be a combination of 2 different types of effects. Like anything in life, there's a lot of things going on at the same time, right? So it's not just one of these happening at the same time, they happen simultaneously. So the easiest one is the substitution effect. This goes back to like almost module 4, right? When we're talking about substituting between 2 goods. I'm going to buy, so I would set this up, say, okay, here's the quantity of both of these goods, and I'm just going to use directional arrows. I'm not going to ask you about how much they change. I'll be more likely to ask you about directional changes. How much they change, I drew the graphs out for you. How to identify the substitution income gets a little bit trickier. Might not push you that far. I might just expect you to kind of know how to do directional changes. So if the prices go down for ramen, am I going to buy more or less ramen? So just in terms of the substitution effect, if the price is lower, I'm going to buy what is now relatively cheaper, right? If you walk into a store and all of a sudden they lower the price of something, you're more likely to buy that, okay? So if the price goes down, I'm more likely to buy that good, which if I'm substituting away to buy this good, that means the amount of caviar I'm buying must be going down. That's the substitution effect. I'm just buying what is relatively cheaper, not buying what is now relatively a little bit more expensive. That one is always the same. Doesn't matter if they're normal or inferior goods. Okay. So we've got this substitution effect, right? And this will always work the same way. Whatever price is lower, we buy more of that. Okay. The income effect, you can memorize this. So I had someone come in my office yesterday. I was like, oh yeah, if prices go down, the income effect for a normal good would be this. And if you want to memorize it, you can. I don't think that's the best way to get the correct answer, right? You want to understand the concept so that things change. You don't, or you don't memorize it wrong. What is a price change always going to do? If I have the same money in my pocket, but prices are lower, what's happening to my real income? So if prices are lower, that same amount of money in my pocket, I can buy more or less. More. So what's happened to the real value of my income? It's went up. If it helps to think about the idea it's always talked about during business school, inflation, prices going up. What does that do to the amount of your income? It's almost like you have less income, right? Price is lower, it's almost like you have more income. You can afford to buy more with the same amount of dollars, right? So now we can identify the income effect, because the income effect doesn't operate just through the amount of money in your pocket. It operates through what can you buy with that money. So if the real value of my income goes up, what's going to happen for a normal good? I'm going to buy more of it. If I have an inferior good and I have more income, I'm actually going to buy less of it. Okay? So we can identify the income and substitution effect. If I hadn't told you what the total effect was in this problem, and I asked you, what is the total effect on both of these goods? What would you tell me? I can't identify it, or usually use this term of indeterminate, right? I've got the income and substitution effect pushing them in opposite directions. I don't know. I would need to know something about the size of those effects. Now, if I know the total effect, if I'm buying more ramen, which of these effects has to be larger? If the substitution effect is increasing how much I buy, the income effect is decreasing, and I know the total is that I buy more, which of these effects had to be larger? I'm not trying to trick you. All right, you can put numbers to it. If this goes up by 3, this goes down by 2, this would go up by 1. Which of these has to be larger? Substitution effect. All right. Now that's only because I told you what that total effect was. If I hadn't, then you don't know, right? It's indeterminate. I don't know what that total effect would be. I can't tell you which of these effects would be larger. Okay. Any questions on this one? Okay. So just to kind of go through a different, what if I had the price of caviar go up? Okay. And let's say I don't tell you the total effect. Let's just try to identify what we can, right? So anytime you have a problem like this, I would just write out the 3 types of effects: a substitution, income, and total. If the price of caviar goes up, what's going to happen for the I don't even have to think about income yet. What's going to be the substitution effect? So if I think about ramen and caviar here, for the substitution effect, what's going to happen? What is now more expensive? Caviar. So I'm going to buy less of that, which inherently means I'm going to substitute away and buy more of the now relatively cheaper good ramen. So that's my substitution effect. Doesn't matter if it's a normal or inferior good. What about the income effect? Now, once again, if I was doing it, I would then draw this out and say, okay, what's that going to do to my real income? Prices are higher, inflation, what happens to the real value of my income? Goes down. So for a normal good, if I have less money, so caviar's over here, right? If I have less money for a normal good, I'm going to buy less of it. If it's an inferior good, when I have less money, I'm going to buy more of it. So this is a scenario where caviar got more expensive. What's the total effect definitely going to be for these? Well, here they're pushing them in the same direction. It's not going to be indeterminate. I for sure know what that total effect is going to be. Okay? I don't know how large, but I know the directional change. You will definitely see a question about income substitution effects similar to this. Okay? I may do it more like this, where I don't give you the total effect, right? And maybe I just ask you certain questions about the income or substitution effect. But I guarantee you'll see one, if not kind of two questions related to this. Okay. Any questions on anything I did here? Yeah. In terms of numbers? Nope. Just thinking about like directional changes. Yep. Any other questions on this one? Okay. 11. Yeah, so this might also be a time I can kind of give you some test taking techniques. So, you know, me giving you a multiple choice exam. So why do your professors like multiple choice exams? It's not because they're easier to write. It's much easier to write an open response. It's harder to grade them, but it's much easier to write them, right? But if you understand concepts, I can kind of test you along the way to make it more likely that you get the correct answer, even if you don't know 100% how to solve that problem, right? So as long as you understand some of the concepts, you can sometimes figure out what the correct answer is, even if you're not 100% sure how to solve the entire problem if you didn't have any options at all. So in this one, I've got this graph. So what type of externality do I have depicted here? So this goes back, what type of externalities do we have? Positive and negative. I said we always are going to model negative externalities. Well, what is a negative externality? It's an additional cost. So I'm going to model that through the supply curve. Supply curve represents marginal costs. Positive externality represents an additional benefit to society. So how am I going to model that? Through my demand. That's the only type of depictions I would give you on the exam, and that's how I would model them. Okay? That's going to always lead you to the correct answer. You can model them other ways and get to the correct, it's just a little bit less intuitive. Right? So here I've got what type of externality? The social costs are higher, so I have a negative externality. In fact, just to kind of round out, and this might answer some of the questions along the way, what would the value of my negative externality be here? So how would I find it's exactly the same as a tax. The difference between my supply curve and the supply curve with the tax, how did I find the value of the tax? I looked at the same quantity and I looked at the difference vertically, right? So if I want to know the value of my negative externality, I'm going to find some quantity here. I'm going to have two, so I'm going to have to use one of them. And look at the difference vertically between, well, what were the private marginal costs and what were the marginal costs to society? So if I look at 45 here, what's the difference between the supply curve and the marginal social costs? 50 to 80, so my negative externality would be 30. We don't need a calculator for that, but you'll have one if you do, right? I could also use the quantity of 40. What's the difference between the private marginal cost there and the marginal social cost? 40 and 70. Once again, you get the same value. That negative externality is $30. Okay. So if I'm thinking about what action would solve the deadweight loss that exists because I have this negative externality. So I'm going to draw this out. It won't answer this question per se, but I think it'll be helpful for other types of questions you could see. So if I have a market, where will that market equilibrium be? Right here. If I have this negative externality, where would society want the equilibrium to be, or where would the efficient point for society be, where the marginal social cost hits the marginal benefit, right? So we can kind of think about this as like society's optimal quantity. So the market is going to be what? Under or overproducing? Yeah, the quantity is higher, so they are overproducing. So if I'm overproducing, that means I'm producing more units than what was maximizing society's surplus. So that means some of those units must have had negative surplus. So let's think about, for every unit here, what is the surplus to society? So if I want society's surplus, that's the difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs. Now, here, society's marginal benefits, there's no positive externalities, so that's just the same as the private marginal benefits. So for every unit here, the marginal benefits to society are right here. The marginal costs to society are right here. So when the market overproduces, what's true about every unit in this range? The surplus would be, the benefits are lower than the costs, every unit there would have positive or negative surplus. Negative, right? If I'm subtracting a larger value from the smaller value, everything's going to be negative here. So by overproducing, every unit here, the market is producing a unit that has negative surplus to society. So for society, what's this going to represent? If it's negative surplus, that's a loss of surplus. So that would be what for society? Deadweight loss. Right? And if I had values here, I could calculate exactly what that deadweight loss is. So what is one way I can push the market back to that lower quantity? We've actually already looked at it today. A tax, right? I want to get it such that the supply curve plus my tax matches up with society's marginal cost. Then the market, producers will start making decisions as though they are facing society's costs. They weren't before, right? They were ignoring it. Okay? So this is the idea of like pollution. If you don't charge me anything and I'm a company, I don't care that I'm polluting and hurting society. I'm just going to make decisions that benefit my company. Now, if you start to tax me on my emissions, now I start to change my production process, right? Because now I have to face this new cost. So how can I get the perfect tax? The perfect tax would be equal to what? 30, or in general terms, whatever that value of the negative externality is, which we said earlier was $30. So part of this is if I can identify what that negative externality is, I know that even if I was confused, I'm like, I don't remember if on negative externalities, does the government use subsidies or these taxes? At least you know the value, whatever that externality was, that's what that tax or subsidy should be, $30. Now, this is where don't get too lost in the graphs. So we've got a graph here of taxes. What are taxes going to do to the quantity? Increase or decrease it? Yeah, the graph tells us that it'll decrease it. Well, intuitively, if we see that the market's overproducing and I want to force it to a lower quantity, if I charge people more money, I tax them, what am I going to do to the amount of production? I'm going to decrease it. So you don't have to get too lost in the graphs there. If I can identify that, there's a negative externality in this example, what automatically, if I'm just having the choice between subsidies and taxes, what do I know the government is going to have to use? There's a negative externality. That means there's going to be too much of this good. How can the government limit how much is produced? Tax fees, right? That means people will do less. If I subsidize them, what's going to happen in that market? Just intuitively. If I give people money for doing something, am I going to see more or less of it? More. So what would a subsidy solve? Positive externalities, right? So taxes, we had this problem of the market's not factoring in these costs, they're overproducing. How can we push quantity down? Well, we can create this additional cost on people, a tax. With a subsidy, what's that going to look like? Well, once again, we've got our market. Before we even model the subsidy here, this is where the market would get to on its own. if I have a subsidy, we said those are positive or additional benefits. So how I'm going to model that through my supplier demand curve. Well, what represents benefits? Demand. So I'm going to model it through my just wasting your own time. If I have a positive externality, that's an additional benefit. If demand represents benefits, how am I going to model a positive externality? Through the demand curve. So at every point, this marginal benefits to society are going to be higher, right? So where would the society like that equilibrium point to be? Society would like that quantity to be higher. So how can I force the market to a higher quantity? Well, if I tax people, you think I'm going to get more of the good? No. So how can I get more of it? I give them a subsidy until that demand curve exactly matches up with that marginal social benefit curve. So if it helps, there's other tools we have to limit quantity. So what are some things if I had a negative externality? So before I keep moving, are any questions on this before I want to keep just talking without giving a little bit of a pause here? So yeah. The vertical difference between those two lines, marginal cost, marginal social cost, or in this case, the difference between the demand curve or private marginal benefits and the marginal social benefits. Yep. So maybe one way, there's other questions like, oh, if we have a negative externality, what are some tools we could use or vice versa? The only thing that we talked about that increases quantity was subsidies. So if you see a problem and there's a positive externality and it asks you what the government can do, every answer to other than subsidies, you can rule out, right? Now, what are some of the other tools that we had for negative externalities? We had a few more, right? So we've already talked about taxes, and I'm going through this because I think this will be helpful on some of the problems. And I wrote the exam, so I might have some idea, right? So let's say I've got my equilibrium quantity here. Right? If I've got a negative externality, and I want to get to that socially efficient quantity for society. Right? We already said we can use taxes, so that one makes sense, I think, intuitively. The other ones that aren't quite as intuitive is we said we could use what? What? So permits, that is one, but that's essentially like you're paying for, that's essentially like taxes, right? Because you're having to pay an additional amount. So what are some other tools that we kind of focused on the government has? We can impose a quota, and this is where it might get a little bit confusing because the connotation with quotas, like usually it's like you have to meet a quota, right? But in terms of government intervention, usually when we say a quota, it's like a limit. So we could set a quota and just say, well, look, we're not going to allow the market to produce past this point. That's kind of the idea of tradable permits. If we only give so many permits, we know that we're only allowing a certain quantity. You can't go past that, right? So that's one of the tools we can also use to limit quantity, get to the same point as if we had a tax, right? So we said we could also use a tax. What are some other tools we had? Price floors. Now, if I'm setting an effective price floor, right? So let's say I put a price floor down here. So this is a way we can remember what is a price floor and a price ceiling. A price floor says I can't go any lower. So that means the price can't be below this. If I set the price floor here, what's going to happen in this market? Is the price below that? No, so things just keep operating. So this would be a what? Not an effective price floor, but an ineffective. So instead of setting a price floor here, what would be effective? Setting a price ceiling, right? That means I can't go any higher than that. Oh, well, then the price can't get to that equilibrium point. So if the price is forced to be this low, suppliers or producers are going to stop right here because the marginal cost to them is greater than the marginal benefit, what's the marginal benefit to producers? How much they can sell that good for, right? So the price is the marginal benefit to producers. So a price ceiling would also kind of limit the quantity at this point. Now, if I wanted to use an effective price floor, I could also do that. But there I would have to set it somewhere above the equilibrium price, right? Now, at any quantity past this, the price to consumers is greater than their marginal benefit. So they're not going to want to buy any of these goods. The quantity would stop here as well. So all of these tools are things we can use to limit quantity, right? Some of them are price controls. Some of them are quantity controls. We also have kind of taxes, which is like internalizing the cost to the people in the market. And so all of them push me to this lower quantity. What did we do with all of these? We eliminated our deadweight loss to society, right? We've gotten rid of that, okay? The only tool we had with subsidies, we said, was using a subsidy. Sorry. The only tool we had for positive externalities was using a subsidy, right? So you ever see something about negative externalities? Cross out every answer that says subsidy. If you're thinking about positive externalities, the only thing that does make sense is a subsidy, okay? Questions here before we keep moving? Yeah, it's a good question. So once again, I think like people like to memorize this. Actually, okay, I don't want to go too much of a side, but I know someone who has a kid and they're going from second to third grade, they're having trouble with times tables, right? So they can do the multiplication if they write it out, use their fingers, but they're having a hard time just being like quick rote memorization. Rote memorization is fine if you can do that. By all means, do it. It's not going to be as beneficial, I think, in getting the correct answers because things change in every problem. It's hard to memorize every different combination. So I would start out with the concept, and I think it's going to make it a little bit easier. So people want to memorize like, oh, positive externalities, the triangles on the right or on the left. First of all, right or left is a very ambiguous term. It starts to get really confusing. So if we think about what surplus is, it doesn't matter what I'm looking at, producers, consumers, society, it's the difference between marginal benefits, marginal costs. So if I want society's surplus, that's going to be the difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs. Well, if I don't have any negative externalities here, what's the social cost of society? That would just be my private marginal cost or my supply curve. Right? There's no negative externalities here. Now, the marginal social benefit we said is a little bit higher than demand. So if we think about this market, we said it is underproducing. So for every unit in this range, the market stops here. So for every unit in this range, what is true for society's surplus? Well, the difference between the marginal social benefit and then society's marginal costs, here the benefits are greater than the cost. So this would all represent what type of surplus to society? Positive or negative? The benefits are greater than the cost. This would all be positive surplus. However, the market stopped here without a subsidy. So without a subsidy, if we have positive externalities, this would all represent surplus that we are missing out on or foregoing, or essentially it's kind of like almost an opportunity cost. We're missing out on this positive surplus. So this would represent our loss of surplus or our deadweight loss. Right? If the market would go out to this higher quantity, there's positive surplus to be had for society from all of those units. The problem is, without any additional incentives, the market stops at a quantity that's too low. So how can we eliminate that deadweight loss, push the market out to that higher quantity? Well, with a positive externality, how can I incentivize someone to do something? The only tool we had was subsidies. Yep. Any other questions on either of those here? I know, I mean, there's quite a few questions on externalities. Kind of this is the idea. We're combining price controls with externalities. We'll start to see as we progress, these modules start to be more and more intertwined, right? Any other questions on these? If not, any other specific problems people want to see worked through? Let me look at time. So I have one that I think will be beneficial, unless anyone is like has a dying question. Okay, so also, what does that mean? A question they're dying to ask, a dying question. That's a little morbid for a 8 a.m. class, right? So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to look at this table. So I can guarantee you that you will see a table like this on the exam, right? And I will ask you questions related to it, okay? So there's a couple concepts that I would keep in mind to answer a bunch of different questions. We'll probably answer them along the way, okay? So I'm going to write this down before I can switch over and then write it. Maybe. There we go. So I've got quantity. I've got my total variable cost, my total fixed costs, my total costs. I'm then going to do my average variable costs. I'm going to need some more room. So we're going to do our average. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I get this in the same order so it's not confusing. And then we have our marginal costs. Okay. So I've got quantity jumps of 1 here. So I'm going to make this a little bit more difficult to kind of just show you, and you guys might have to help me out with the, well, I'll make it easy so you might have to help me with the math. Instead of jumps of 1, I'm going to do jumps of 10. So these numbers aren't going to perfectly line up with the problems or the values that we see in the problem. You can kind of work through those. You have those in the practice problems available to you. So I think it's helpful if I work through one where you don't see quantity jumps of 1, because you might not see that on the exam. Okay. So let's say I use the same cost though for everything else. So I've got 0, 10, I've got 700, 750. I've got average variable costs of 15, and then I've got average total costs of 400 out here. Okay. So if it were me, the first thing I would do if I had a table like this, and this is actually going to help you answer one of the first questions very quickly from the practice exam, is we can always fill out our total fixed costs and our average fixed cost columns pretty quickly. Okay. So my total fixed costs, what are fixed costs? They're costs I have to pay no matter how much I'm producing. Okay. In fact, I've got to change this number, I think. This is going to be 1.5. And this is going to be 40 to kind of line up with my change in the quantities here. So if I'm producing nothing, what are the only type of costs I have? Fixed costs. So if I looked at this, when I'm producing nothing, what must my total fixed cost be? Well, if my total costs are 700, all of those are fixed costs, right? So looking at that quantity of 0 is probably one of the easier ways to identify what your fixed costs are. Now, am I in the long or the short run here? If I have any fixed costs, I'm in the short run. So anytime you have any fixed costs that are anything other than 0, which you likely will, otherwise this table becomes a lot easier and probably not something I would use for questions, you're in the, short run. Now, once I know the total fixed cost at a quantity of 0, what's my total fixed cost at every other quantity? Same thing, right? Because it's just the total fixed cost. This is like how much I've got to pay for rent, right? Or my lease, right? It doesn't matter how much I produce, I've got to pay the exact same amount. So once I have my total fixed cost column, I can always fill out my average fixed cost. So anytime we want an average, it doesn't matter if it is, so my average variable, my average fixed, or my average total costs, it's always just going to be whatever that cost is, so variable, fixed, or total, divided by quantity. I mean, that's how you find an average. You take a total and you divide it by the number of numbers you have. What is the number of numbers we have? The number of units. So here, how could I find my average fixed costs? All I'm going to do is take that total fixed cost and divide it by quantity. So I can't really do an average at 0, but 700 over 10 would be what? 70. 700 over 20 would be 35. 700 over 30 would be 20. Hold on. What is it? 700. So 23. No. Yeah, 23.33 repeated, right? And then 700 over 40, I've got what? 22.5 if I'm doing math. No. Oh, 17.5. Sorry. Thank you. All right. So I can fill out those two columns very quickly, right? Once I know that total fixed cost, I just go through and divide that by the quantities. Okay. Any questions on that? So now the rest of this becomes a lot easier to fill in other than the marginal cost. We'll talk about that one last. So if I know my total cost and I know my total fixed cost, what is the total variable cost? So the other equation that we have is my total costs are just the sum of the only two types of costs we talked about, which were the variable and the fixed costs. So if I know the total cost is 750, I know my total fixed cost is 700. What does my total variable cost have to be? A little bit of algebra, I can see that has to be 50, right? And then if I want the total cost here, what would it be at 10 units? Yeah. Like this should be very quick. My total costs are just the sum of my variable and fixed costs. So down here, okay, I can't quite fill this in. I need to do a little bit more work here, right? If I wanted to fill these in, because I am now missing two pieces of information. Okay. So, but I'm going to kind of keep running with this. So here I'm looking at this. I'm like, okay, I don't know my total variable costs, but what do I know? My average variable costs, right? So my average variable costs are my total variable costs over quantity. I'm just using this average equation. So at 30 units, my average variable cost was 1.5. So if I do a little bit of kind of algebra here, my total variable cost would be, 45, which now what's my total cost? 745, right? So I would kind of go through, do as much as you can. Then, okay, if I know the average, I can back out a total. If I know a total, I can then figure out the average, right? If my total variable cost at 10 units is 10, right? What is my average variable cost? Well, 10 over 10 would be 1. If I can't really do an average at 0, so these averages are going to be kind of, nothing here. But if I know at a quantity of 20, my total variable cost is 50. 50 over 20 would be what? No, yep, 2.5. Right, I'm looking at this right. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. All right, so I've got one more column, right? So this is what I would kind of start out with. I would try to build the fixed costs. I would then try to do the total columns, because once I have the totals, I'm always going to give you these quantities. It's very easy to fill in the averages. So if I've got an average total cost of 40, so once again, average total cost is just my total cost over quantity. So if my average total cost is 40 at a quantity of 40, what does my total cost have to be? A little bit of algebra, right? Wait, did I do this wrong? Average total cost is 40, quantity is 40. So yeah, I get what? 1,600. What am I doing? What did I not do right here? I screwed something up. What did I screw up? Oh, because I changed these. These are all going to be a decimal off, aren't they? So I changed the quant. Or no. What did I do wrong here? So here I had variable cost should be 45. Oh, these should be, this should be 4. No, that's not right either. What do I want here? Oh, the average, I wrote this number down wrong. That's why. So the average total cost in this problem was 200. So I want it to be instead 2. Sorry, I looked at that number wrong when I was writing it down. So instead of 40 here, I have 2, which would make this a little bit more sense, which would be 80. So this would give me kind of 780 here. Sorry about that. I don't know what I was looking at. So I've now got kind of all my total columns. I could then fill out the averages pretty easily because all I'm going to do is take the total cost divided by quantity, total fixed cost divided by quantity, total variable cost divided by quantity. Okay? So I could fill all those columns in pretty quickly. Okay? So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through and do that, but that would be all you need to do. So once you've got those total columns, you could easily find those averages. Now, I don't think in this problem, we actually maybe need to do every single point in this graph. I'm just kind of showing how you could fill out the entire thing. Okay. Now, what if I wanted to find marginal costs here? All right. So if I wanted to find marginal costs, that's going to be a change in my total divided by a change in quantity. Right. So once I have these columns, it becomes a lot easier because the change in my total cost, right, divided by a change in quantity, well, once I have those total costs, it's pretty easy. So if I want the marginal cost of 40 units, what was the change in my total cost? So it went from, what, 745 to 780. So that would be 35 divided by a change in the number of units, which was 10. So I get a marginal cost of 3.5. If I wanted the marginal cost here, did I do one of these numbers wrong too? 1.5, 750. No, that's good. I would do what? Here I had a weird one where I had total cost being lower. So it was what? Negative 5 over 10 or negative 0.5. Right? Would be kind of my marginal costs. Must have screwed something up here now that I'm looking at this. What did I do wrong here? 30, 45. No, this is right. This one would be 50. 750, 750. No, that's right. All right. So I probably shouldn't try to change those numbers on the fly, but that would be the idea of kind of how you would go through. I would start with the fixed cost columns, then progress to filling out the totals. Once you have the totals, you can then fill out kind of your marginal costs. Okay. Now you'll see like here. Let's see. So I only asked you what, 3 questions here. So the first one, once again, kind of easy, just identifying those fixed costs at that quantity of 0. Once we have any type of fixed cost, we know what we're in the short run. So if we're even looking at these, if we remember what the short and long run is, the short run is we have some fixed costs. This one would make no sense. The long run is when we can eliminate all fixed costs. So this one would make any sense. So we've at least narrowed it down to a 50-50 answer. Now, if we look at that quantity of 0, we said all of our costs would be fixed costs. So we knew they were 700, which represented we were in the short run. Now, here, I might ask you something a little more simple. If I wanted the total cost of the 4th unit here, kind of similar to what we just did, we don't have to build out the whole table here. If I know my average total cost is 200, I know my quantity is 4, all I have to do is plug them into that average total cost is my total cost over quantity and kind of solve for that thing I don't know. So what? 200 times 4 there, my total cost would be 800, right? Just 200 times 4. I think ours was 80 because I changed the decimal, I changed the quantity jumps of 10 to just kind of show you that. Now, if I want the marginal cost of this 2nd unit, same kind of idea. What am I going to need? I'm going to need my total costs. Well, this would be one where I don't have to fill out the entire table. We said, if I start with this fixed cost column, and I just fill all this in, what do my total costs have to be here? 710. How do I find the marginal cost of that 2nd unit? Our marginal costs. So this is the marginal anything. Marginal product of labor, marginal benefit, marginal cost. The marginal anything is a change in that thing. So a change in our total cost from a change in output. So our total costs were 750 and 710, going from that first to that second unit. Here's why I changed the quantity, because when you have quantity jumps of 1, what's the change in quantity? Well, it's easy. It's always just a jump of 1. So dividing by 1, here I would have marginal costs of 40 for that second unit. So when I ask these questions, it probably won't be as involved as what I just did, working through that, like filling out all the spots in the table. It's likely just going to be, there'll only be 1 or 2 or 3 I ask you about, and it might be a little bit easier than some of what we were kind of doing over here, right? But those are the types of questions I would ask you related to a table like this, right? So kind of notice we only filled in like, what, this one was the other one that we did, which was total costs, which was what, 800. I mean, we didn't fill in much of the table here, right? Just based off the 3 questions I asked, this is all we really needed to fill in. But I could ask you about any one of those points there, and you have enough information here to be able to solve for. Okay. Any questions related to kind of these table examples yet? You're gonna have to speak up a little bit. So I said, if it were me, I would fill out that total fixed cost column first. If you need the average fixed costs, you can fill that column out right away. If you don't need them, you don't have to, right? But it might be in other examples helpful, right? It just depends. But yeah, then I would kind of start with the totals before I start with averages, right? So generally, kind of like in this one, I'm asking you about a total cost. You're using the average to kind of back it out. So the hard and fast rule is always start out with that total fixed cost column. That's the one thing that you can kind of guarantee is always going to probably be the most beneficial when you're trying to answer questions related to these tables. All right. Any other questions for keeping moving here? Any other specific problems that people want to see worked through? Which one? Oh, HHI. Yeah, so we kind of left off break talking about the end of this chapter for the firm's costs. We started to introduce the idea of firm concentration or market concentration, right? So we had 2 measures, firm concentration ratio. This, I hope, is an easy 4 points on the exam. I will ask you a question maybe about that includes a firm concentration ratio. It should be easy. How would I find the firm concentration ratio if I give you what the market share of all these? There's only 5 firms here. How do I find the firm concentration ratio?
Over the entire market.
Yeah, so here, I don't even have to do that, right? Because I don't even have the total amount. I think in the practice problems, I gave you like the sales. So you had to add up the sales of the top 4 firms divided by the total sales in the industry. Here, I've already converted things into percentages. So that firm concentration ratio is in terms of percent. So what am I going to do? Just take the top 4 firms and add up their percent market share. What are the top 4 firms here? 46 plus 32 plus 10 plus 8 should give me 96%, right?
We need to know what the ranges and what type of market they represent.
No. Not every single market. What I might expect you to know is something about what would the 4 firm concentration ratio be of a monopoly? There's how many firms are in a monopoly? So what's the 4 firm concentration ratio going to be? 100%. What's the 4 firm concentration ratio going to be if I have 2 firms splitting it evenly? Well, each firm would have, so my 4 firm concentration ratio would be 100%. So this is the idea that 4 firm concentration ratio, we can identify some of these really concentrated markets, but I can't tell you the difference between a market that has 1 firm, 2 firms, 3 firms, or 4, because they're all going to add up to 100%. So back to the original question, what's the other thing we can use to do that is going to be this index called the HHI, right? So what are we going to do there? The HHI, we're going to take every firm, their market share, square it, and add them all up. Now, when we talk about this market share, it's going to be, well, here, it's going to be in terms of percents, right? So what is their percentage that helps market share? Okay. So in our example, we only had 5 firms. I'm not going to give you like an example with 20. That would take too much time, right, on the exam. But I might give you one with 5 firms. So we're going to go through and say, okay, what would the HHI be? 46 squared plus 32 squared plus 4 squared plus 10 squared plus 8 squared, right? So this is going to be just kind of a making sure we can get this entered into our calculator correctly, right? So these shouldn't be too difficult of questions on the exam, these HHI and 4-firm concentration ratios. Now, the only other thing other than just calculating, so maybe I combine the calculation of these indexes with then how to identify certain markets. So why is the HHI a little bit better of a measure than the 4-firm concentration ratio? What would the HHI be for a monopoly? Well, what's the market share for a monopolist? They have 100% of the entire market. So this would be an HHI of 10,000. What if I had 2 firms kind of splitting it evenly? Well, before with our 4-firm concentration ratio, we said they would both be 100%, right? Now with our HHI, this would be what? 50 squared plus 50 squared. I've got 2 firms splitting it evenly. So now I get an HHI of 5,000, right? What would the HHI of a perfectly competitive market be really close to? Not going to be exactly this, but it's going to get closer and closer to 0, right? You can kind of think about if I had like 0.1 squared plus 0.1 squared, I've got 1,000 different, it gets really, it's a lot smaller. Now, we're never going to get it truly to be 0 because nothing's truly perfectly competitive, but that lower the HHI, the more competitive the market, the higher the HHI, the less competitive, right? The least competitive market being a monopoly with an HHI of 10,000. But knowing how to calculate it is going to be kind of what you should focus on. But I could also maybe then ask, what would the HHI be of a monopolist? And you'd still use the same equation. It's just you need to know the idea that a monopoly market, we had 1 firm. Okay. What do we got? Another 15 minutes. Any other questions people wanted to see worked through here? Old practice problems, quizzes, any other practice questions on this exam? We're all gonna get A's? 23? I hope everybody gets A's. I mean, those of you who showed up, I'm guessing you're gonna do better than the vast majority of people that didn't. So, okay, this is a good one. So here I'm telling you 2 different goods. I'm giving you income, prices, and the margin utility of the last good purchased. So instead of going to the problem, I'll kind of write down the information we're given. So I've got Den Pops and I've got hamburgers here. So we're just going to write down everything that we know. So the margin utility of the last pop is 10, 15. Prices are 1 and 2. Okay. So here's where we went through some graphs that maybe you won't be forced to use, but you need to know the ideas of what those graphs represent, right? So this is something else that I saw kind of some confusion on. So here we could kind of think about if I have an income constraint or a budget constraint, that's telling me, and we could put, I don't know, Den Pops up here, we could put hamburgers down here, right? So if I'm spending all of my money on these 2 goods, this would represent different combinations I could afford, right? So if I'm only buying good Y, how much could I afford? My income divided by whatever the price of good Y is. So in this example, I think my income was 20. So if I'm only buying the Den Pops here, what's the total amount I could afford? Well, the price of that Y good is $1. So here this would be a quantity of 20. What if I'm only buying hamburgers here? Well, the total amount I can afford is my income over the price of that X good or hamburgers. So how much could I afford to buy if I'm only buying hamburgers? 20 over 2 would be 10. these represent quantities. If I calculate the slope using quantities, what am I going to do? Well, I've got a y variable and x variable. This is math. It's just a change in y, or change in our quantity of our y good, over the change in the quantity of our x good, right? So this was y, and this was x. So I would have here what? 20 over 10, right? Or this would be a slope of, and it's technically it's negative, right? Since I'm kind of downward sloping. Now, I'm not always going to give you enough information to be able to identify that slope using the quantities, right? If I didn't give you income here, then you couldn't figure out what these quantities are. But you could still tell me the slope of the budget constraint. Why? Because no matter what income is, if I were to kind of go through the math, and you're not going to have to every single time, but the change in y would be m over the price of the y good divided by m over the price of the x good. The m's cancel, and I end up with the slope, and sorry, technically this was negative, that if I'm not using quantities, but I'm using prices, then the slope of this curve is the price of the x good, so the price of hamburgers here, over the price of my y good. So if I do that, I get what? 2 over 1, or same kind of thing, I get that slope of -2. So I can use quantities or prices. So this is where I think people get confused. If I'm calculating the slope of that line, why is it x over y? When you calculate a slope, it's always y over x. Well, the depiction that we have, what is our y and our x? Our y and our x would be the quantity of the y good and the quantity of the x good. If we're using prices, just the simple laws of math, the way that we have this, it would end up being the price of x over the price of y, okay? And we worked through another way. We had the budget equation written out, and I solved for qy in terms of qx, and we saw that the slope would always be this kind of ratio of prices. Now, it does seem a little counterintuitive, but that's sometimes math is. Math is sometimes intuitive, sometimes it's counterintuitive, right? So if I'm using prices, it's the x goods price over the y goods price, okay? Any questions on that idea? And I'll get to whoever asked. I'm going to answer the actual question, but I think this might be helpful for the exam, okay? So what are we going to try to do? Well, we can afford all these different combinations of the two goods, but there's going to be one combination that allows us to get to this highest level of utility, or our highest indifference curve, okay? So what did we say was the slope of our indifference curve? That represented our marginal rate of substitution. Now, what that represented, it also is somewhat counterintuitive. It's not the price of the x good over the price of the y good, but it was the marginal utility of the x good over the marginal utility of our y good. So if I look at these marginal utilities, notice here I've got what? 15 over 10, so this would be 1.5. Oh, these slopes aren't the same. When I am spending at that optimal point, when I have the optimal combination of these two goods, the slope of my budget constraint should be the same as the slope of that indifference curve. So what this means is I'm on an indifference curve that's lower. I'm at some point on my budget constraint where those two slopes are not the same. So what do I want to do? Well, if I was here, I want to move towards that point, right? So how can we use maybe an easier definition to kind of think about, well, then how should I change my spending habits, right? So I think in this one, it asks you, should you buy more Den Pops or more hamburgers? When we're at this point, we said, here was our marginal rate of substitution. That was the slope of our indifference curve. That should be the same as the slope, and there's technically negative signs here, of our budget constraint. Well, if I rearrange this a little bit, all this is saying is that the marginal utility per dollar of both goods should be the same when I'm spending optimally. When I'm at this point where the two curves have the same slope, that would also imply they have the same marginal utility per dollar. All I did was rearrange this here, okay? So what are my X and what are my Y goods? Well, I had what? Hamburgers here. Dem pops. So I'm just going to plug in my values. So for hamburgers, I had what? The margin utility was 15 over a price of 2. And here I had margin utility of 10 over a price of 1. So 7.5, this is 10. So which of these goods has a higher margin utility per dollar? The Den pops. So what should I buy more of? If something is giving me a higher level of additional utility per dollar I'm spending, do I want to buy more or less of that? More. So we want to buy more of this good. So increase the quantity of Den pops here, decrease the quantity of hamburgers. As we do that, what's going to happen? Prices don't change, but as I buy more of something, what's going to happen to the marginal utility of the last one that I bought? So as you buy more of something, the margin utility is going to go down. This is the idea that like the first house gives me way more higher margin utility than the second house I buy, and so on and so forth. If I buy less of something, what's happening to the margin utility of that good? So if prices stay the same, but the numerators are changing in this way, what's happening to my margin utility per dollar? This one's going up, this one's going down until we get to that point where they're exactly equal. Right? So we didn't need to draw all of this out. This was more so that maybe some other problems that might be helpful and kind of remembering what the slope of that budget constraint is, what the slope of our indifference curve is. But in terms of where should I be at when I'm spending optimally, it's where the margin utility per dollar of both goods is exactly the same. Okay. You guys are in a hurry to get out of here, I guess. All right. Guess we know everything. We don't need to use the last 4 minutes to answer any more questions. Does anybody have any other questions? Yeah. I mean, basically, all we want to know is when we're spending optimally, is the margin utility per dollar the same for both goods? If it's not, we need to buy more of whatever good has a higher margin utility per dollar, less of the good that has a lower.
We need to like understand the average, total cost per item, the average.
Yeah, so this is what I would say for those averages, the marginal cost. And I think this is problem 33 or something. I actually give you some values. So if I'm looking at a firm's costs, my marginal cost initially, if they're decreasing, what portion of the marginal cost curve am I on here? I'm experiencing gains from specialization. Right? Now, once my marginal costs start to increase, we said this is because of diminishing returns, right? I'm hiring less and less effective workers, and they're no longer specializing on tasks, or at least the diminishing returns I'm getting overcome those. So what's going to be true about the marginal cost relative to our averages, both our average total and our average variable cost? We said it's going to intersect them at their minimum points, right? So if I'm in the short run, right, I know that my marginal cost curve will hit the averages at their minimum points. So if I give you specific values, for instance, let's say I told you, I don't know if this is the exact values on here. No, we're running out of time, but I want to make sure this is a good question that should be helpful. So let's say the marginal cost was 18. And at this point, I'm changing a little bit from the problem, but let's say the average total was 20. And let's say the average variable was 16. If I want to produce more, right, increase the quantity I produce, if the marginal cost is below my average, what's going to happen to my new average? So remember, marginal is how much I'm adding in. So if I've got an average and I add a number that's smaller than that, what's going to be true about my new average? It's going to be, if you have your grade and you do worse on the quizzes than you have been, what's going to happen to your grade? It's going to go down, right? So anytime that marginal cost is below your average, your new average is a little bit lower, right? If the marginal cost is above your average, what's true about your new average? It's a little bit higher, which is the reason why that marginal cost will hit those averages at their minimum point. As soon as I get to quantities where the marginal cost is above the average, if I continue to increase quantity, what's happening to my average now? Well, now it's increasing. right? So kind of knowing that that marginal cost hits those averages at their minimum point is going to be something that's important for the exam. Another thing I'll kind of mention quickly, my average total cost, it's very similar to when I'm just thinking about my total cost. Average total is the sum of average variable and average fixed. What's happening to my average fixed costs as I increase quantity? If my fixed costs don't change, as I produce more, what's happening to these? They just get closer and closer to, if I'm dividing by larger and larger values, it's getting closer and closer to 0. So what's happening to the gap between my average total and average variable costs? The only difference between them is my average fixed cost. If my average fixed costs are getting close to 0, at higher quantities, that gap is going to be a lot smaller, right? That's why I knew how to draw it that way, okay? So being able to kind of draw a cost structure like this might be helpful, right? Knowing that that marginal cost is going to hit those averages at their minimum point. And then if I give you a problem like 31, you can kind of plot those and kind of have a nice visual to go along with it. So I pushed this right up to 9:15. Once again, I'll be in my office this afternoon, 2 to 3:30. If you have any other questions, I'll look at my email throughout the day tomorrow. Otherwise, I will see you guys for the exam on Thursday.